Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Merle Massey. I'm the coordinator of undergraduate research at the University of Saskatchewan. And this session is being recorded for the SURE program. So that's the Student Undergraduate Research Experience, but it will be posted on our YouTube site and available to anyone, actually, anyone around the world, but of course, mainly for students at the University of Saskatchewan. And our article or our presentation today is from Liv Marken, who is the director of the Writing Centre at the University Library at the University of Saskatchewan. And her talk today is all about writing a journal article. And with that, Liv, you may take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me today on this beautiful day we're having. So as Merle mentioned, I'm the Writing Center director, but I work in the library and I work with various learning specialists and librarians. So I will be putting in a plug for librarians and how they can help you in your journey to write a journal article. And I also, if you have any questions at all about this, I have the perspective of being the staff advisor for the University of Saskatchewan Undergraduate Research Journal. So I've seen a lot of student papers submitted and kind of see ways that students do things well and the way that things could be improved. So a lot of kind of behind the curtain of a journal, what we actually see coming in and what we really appreciate when students submit work. So today we will talk about choosing a journal. I'm not going to talk for very long about that. There are really good resources. Liaison librarians can really help you with that. So if you're writing in, for example, let's say biochemistry, you might talk to the liaison librarian for that department and program, and they can give you some suggestions on where there's major publications. So we'll talk a bit about choosing a journal, but we're mainly going to talk about how to prepare your manuscript for submission. So whether that's something that you wrote as part of a research experience or for a class, how to turn that assignment or that project or that poster into something that you can submit to a journal. And we're really focusing mostly on how to write a journal article, but so there's different types of articles you could write for a journal, but we're going to look at that, but know that there's also lots of other forums for publication or for sharing your work. For example, on Twitter, a lot of academics are very active on Twitter. A lot of graduate students are active on Twitter, and it's a great way for them to have conversations and disseminate their work. There are peer-reviewed blogs. There are all kinds of categories of publication that are good testing grounds before you go to submit your classic manuscript for publication. But that's not to say that you can't just go straight ahead and submit something for publication. So I hope this makes things less intimidating, not more intimidating. I do want to emphasize that with the undergraduate research journal, we see a lot of students who are really shy to submit or lack confidence in submitting. And these happen to be the students who are really high flyers and doing really well. They're very hard on themselves. But know that when you submit something to a journal, what you submit is not what you're going to see in the publication. It goes through a process and it will change and it will improve and it will be adjusted before it actually goes to publication. So don't feel like you're completely exposing yourself and your paper like right away when you submit it. It will go through a process and you'll have a chance to make changes before it goes to publication. So just jump in. Don't even think about it. But first we'll talk about how to prepare your manuscript for submission. So this is a bit of a busy slide, but this is just some tips on choosing a journal. So the first one that I've listed on the top left is the Council for Undergraduate Research webpage. If you just look them up, the Undergraduate Research Journal listing from the Council on Undergraduate Research, they have a list of many journals there. It requires a bit of picking through because some of them are only some of them would only be open to submissions from students from their own institutions, such as the University of Saskatchewan's journal, but there are other journals that accept papers from all over the world or from within Canada. So it's worth going through that. There are a few University of Saskatchewan journals. Pathways is mainly for grad students, but they do accept submissions from undergraduate students. And that's in the Archaeology and Anthropology department. And in medias res is a humanities, fine arts, creative writing publication on campus, and they're really great to work with. And the University of Saskatchewan Undergraduate Research Journal, we publish original research papers, review papers, and we also publish research snapshots. This year, we're moving into new territory where we're also going to be publishing non-traditional research reflections, and so that's really exciting. So if you have something you're not quite sure would be eligible, definitely talk to us, because we're quite open to different ideas for types of submissions from all across the disciplines. I think probably the place that I would go first, though, would be your professor or your supervisor for what would be a good forum for this. Some supervisors will maybe not know enough about the undergraduate research landscape, but they would definitely be able to recommend which journals within the field would be the most appropriate, or how to turn that manuscript or that idea into something that would be appropriate for a specific journal. So they could give you some ideas as well. A liaison librarian, I've already mentioned, you can look up the liaison librarian for the subject that you're writing in, and they might have some leads as well on top journals. And another thing you could do is, for any kind of research paper, you probably did a lot of research. And so you have some kind of literature review on what the conversation was happening already around your topic, and look at who you're citing quite often and where are they published, where was their work published. So if you're looking at your references, you can actually find some of the appropriate journals for your paper. So, all right. You can narrow things down a little bit further. Journal impact factor and journal citation reports is one way to kind of get a hint as to whether or not a journal is reputable, or whether or not you're going to be submitting to a prestigious journal. I would say at the undergraduate student level, unless you're co-authoring and you're secondary author from an instructor, the chances of getting published in one of these, in a journal that tracks impact factor and citation reports, it would be much more challenging, not to say that it's not possible. There have been undergraduate students who've done it at the University of Saskatchewan as co-authors with the professor, but as really taking the lead on the research and the writing as well. So it is possible. It's also a little tricky with journal impact factor because people really put a lot of weight on it, but sometimes it's not always an indication of whether a journal is worthy. So it's something to think about and learn more about through talking to your liaison librarian. If you talk to your professors about it, there's a lot of politics around it and a lot of disciplinary attitudes about journal impact factor and citation reports. So it's very important, obviously, in terms of getting into grad school or demonstrating the value of your research, because a lot of people think that it's incredibly important, but it's really good to learn more about that whole world and how to find that information. We have a good information from a good librarian to talk to would be Dee Dee Dawson at the University of Saskatchewan. She has a lot of knowledge about this area. Another thing to think about is article processing fees. There is occasionally a cost associated. Undergraduate journals do not tend to have this. If you're submitting to medical journals, scientific journals, they often have article processing fees or APFs. So know that our university has discounts available as part of subscription packages that we have to those journals. So definitely talk to a liaison librarian about how to get discounts on article processing fees. I would, though, advocate for open access. Some open access publications have article processing fees, but generally don't. Open access is incredibly important. If your project was funded, for example, with Tri-Council funding, so CIHR or SHRC or NSERC money, it has to be made open access. So that could be through an institutional repository, or that could be by deliberately choosing an open access publication. It's a great idea to learn more about open access because not just for social justice reasons in terms of access to information, that people in various countries and citizens can find information about a particular topic, good peer-reviewed, more reliable information than what they're Googling on the internet. we know now that information literacy is a real concern these days politically. So having that information and that access to information is a political issue, and it's really important in that sense, but it also makes your work more findable. So if you're looking for that open access symbol, if you're looking for an explanation, looking for a real certification of open access rigorous guidelines, look at the directory of open access journals. So if you just Google DOAJ, you should be able to go to the website. You can look up journals in there to see which ones are registered. So the University of Saskatchewan Undergraduate Research Journal is listed in the DOAJ. They have very rigorous criteria for inclusion. So you need to have a certain number of faculty on your editorial board. You have to have specific review processes. You have to have your articles Creative Commons license and open access. So it's something to definitely consider, and something that, you know, a lot of students don't even know exists. They just know whether they can get an article or whether the website's asking you to pay $45 to read an article. It's kind of like, okay, everybody should have open access to knowledge that's funded by, you know, funded publicly quite often. So, so that's a whole topic. Another thing to think about is predatory publishers. So predatory publishers are kind of sketchy, fly-by-night journals that make money. They're open access usually, but that's not necessarily a good thing here. They are open access, but they're going to charge you for publication, and so that you can bulk up your CV with apparently legitimate open access publication forums, but which are not. And so sometimes they can be really slick, and it's difficult to tell whether they're a good journal. They tend to charge significant fees. You might get a spam email through your University of Saskatchewan address. This would happen more to researchers and professors, but they'll have like little tells like overly ornate language or spelling mistakes or flattery, as you know, we love your research and we think we'd like you to be the editor of our journal special issue, that kind of thing. So look at the quality of the writing of the journal, talk to your instructor or supervisor about whether that journal is acceptable. Is it listed within the DOAJ or within Ulrich's periodicals directory? These things you can Google. The website should also be quite detailed in terms of what the journal scope is, specific contact information for people. The editorial board should have credentials, and you should be able to find those people, and they should have a clear articulation of the peer review process. It shouldn't be something where they just quickly edit it and throw it up on their website. One great website is the thinkchecksubmit.org website if you're really concerned about this. I imagine if I were a student, my first instinct would be to talk to a professor in that field in order to understand whether or not that journal is reputable. So we'll talk a bit about writing now. When at USurge at the University of Saskatchewan Research Journal, Undergraduate Research Journal, we the editors, when we get a manuscript, we're not looking at the lower order concerns very much at all, especially early on. What we're really emphasizing at the beginning are what we call HOCs, or higher order concerns. This is a term from writing studies. And so the most important things are more of the broader issues, structural, argumentative, evidence, ethics. All of those things are what are going to be those are the things that you have to jump through to get to the next stage. So we're not going to bother looking at the quality of the writing. Maybe, you know, peripherally, we're obviously thinking about writing quality, but we're not going to be digging into the proofreading, editing issues until we've looked at these things first. So whenever we're writing, we tend to focus on the right column first. We tend to worry about correctness, about sentence structure, about clarity, or about punctuation, spelling, all those kind of nitpicky details. But there's no point really fiddling around with the lower order concerns in your writing process until you've addressed the higher order concerns and attended to those, because when you make changes to the higher order concerns, you're going to introduce or take away some of the lower order concern work. So you could really waste your time if you're focusing on lower order concerns at the same time. So for example, you might be looking at grammar in a paragraph that ends up getting cut anyway or getting adjusted in the higher order concern stage of things. So the separation, of course, isn't so neat and tidy. Sentence structure affects clarity, and word choice might change based on audience, for example. Today, I'm going to focus on higher order concerns. If you're concerned more about copy editing and lower order concerns, there's certainly a lot of resources available through the Writing Centre, and you can contact me if you'd like information about that. And if you're watching this video at some point in the future, 2 years from now, you can contact the library for the Writing Centre, and whether I'm there or somebody else is there, they'll get you some information and some workshops and resources for how to, edit your own, proofread your own work. So I'm going to focus on the higher order concerns. So most journals have a publication agreement, and that publication agreement asks you to sign off on various things such as, have you had ethics approval if you've had animal or human subjects? Do you have, you haven't violated copyright? So for example, if we're writing in the context of a course, we tend to use figures, tables, charts, and graphs from other publications or other sources, and we cite them in the paper. But when it comes to publication, we can't, it depends on the copyright around that image and whether or not we can actually use it. So you want to make sure that you have copyright permissions, or that you make your own tables, charts, graphs, visuals, whatever it is, in order to illustrate a point, or think about whether you really need them, and you can even take them out. Is there a conflict of interest? So especially with the undergraduate research journal here at the university, do you know people on the editorial board? We do have policies around conflict of interest. You can submit, it just wouldn't be in their hands. It would go to somebody else on the journal editorial board. So things like that. Plagiarism might happen unintentionally. So double check your paraphrasing if you've taken information from another source. Check the accuracy of what you're saying, whether you're presenting others' views or others' information in an accurate way. Check your citations to make sure that you've properly cited everywhere. Those are things that we will check, but they're kind of red flags. If we do find one or two, we're likely to say, well, is this paper worth the work? We'll probably send it back to you in order to check. We're not going to send the police to your house or anything like that. We understand that these things can happen by accident, but it creates a lot of work for us if these things aren't done ahead of time. Ethics approval, this can present a problem if you've done something in the context of a class, but it was in that context and now you want to publish it, but you interviewed people for it. You wouldn't have had ethics approval. So you'd have to really adjust how you wrote that paper, or not use the information from the interviewees. And I don't know that you can work retroactively to get ethics approval for something you've already done. So think about that. It's something that if you're going into a class or a research project, you might want to think about in advance, like, oh, I might want to publish this assignment, so maybe my prof can help me with ethics approval processes. Another thing is language bias. We take this pretty seriously at the journal. That could be, for example, a gender biased language or a language that shows racial bias. I would say a really good source for checking your work in this regard would be the new APA, well, it's now a year old, but the new APA guidelines, American Psychological Association. Even if you're not writing in that subject area, they have a great chapter on language bias and research bias. So it's worth having a look just to make some of those changes. We're not going to reject your paper outright based on that, but there will be feedback around that. So we also have Writing Centre workshops on avoiding gender bias and avoiding racial bias. And we're working on one on ableist language as well. I think there are some workshops on this particular topic on EDI in research, and it's a really important and increasingly taken seriously by journals, really important topic. Finally, co-authors. Did you write this with anybody else's help? Do your co-authors know that you're submitting it? Have you decided who the primary author will be, like who will be listed first, those kinds of things. So you do need clear permission, and they need to sign a publication agreement in order to submit. One thing that I didn't list here is that you also need to only submit to one journal at a time. Your paper, in most journals, they don't want you having your paper being considered elsewhere. So now you're down to looking at, now that you've gone through all of those hoops, you're like, okay, I've attended to all of those important primary issues. Now I'm ready to look at the actual paper to think about reframing it. So oftentimes we have written something for a class or for a project or a specific disciplinary audience, and we do need to reframe it a little bit. So sometimes we get what we call the A paper effect. So a student got a 90-something on a paper that they wrote in a linguistics class. And in the context of that class, that mark made sense. But in the context of worldwide publication, it still needs some work. And a lot of that work is just to do with translating that topic to a wider audience. So we'll talk a little bit about articulating the purpose or making it more clear, how to reach a broader audience, how to make your paper flow more logically to somebody who's pretty new to the topic, because your professor tends to really know the topic already. And if they don't, which sometimes they don't, they may be able to flag for you, well, here's where I got stuck. And kind of thinking about too, what's the through line here? What's the story? Like, why am I writing this? And what story am I telling? So we'll talk about structure. There are three kind of ways that I'm quite visual, and three ways that I can kind of think about it are architecturally. So some types of writing are highly structured in the sciences, for example. There's, for good reason, very structured ways of approaching things in terms of sections of a paper and why they're there and what you say in those sections. The Writing Centre can certainly help with that. We do have science writing tutors. So certain types of architectures, though, are more creative. So they do have patterns, but they're in sort of different ways. And I think about the architect Frank Gehry. Gehry. I watched a documentary about him where he took a piece of paper and scrunched it up in kind of like a formation and gave it to one of his architects working with him and said, should you make the building look like this? So some people were freeform. So I love looking at buildings and thinking about how they use repetition and pattern in order to create a structure. And that's kind of what happens in writing. We use repetition, pattern, categories in order to create a structure that makes sense as a whole. Another way to think of it is bird's eye view. So when you're flying over this topic, like what's the big point and how does it look laid out on the ground? You could think of that as a balcony view as well. Some people call it that. So one example of that is if I write an article, I might print it and lay it out on the floor or use print preview to see where there's patches where I've maybe really written like a 2-page paragraph versus a 1-page paragraph, and where there might be imbalances, like actual structural physical imbalances, or I might go through and color code. So I'm talking about this topic again on page 3, but I should move this to page 2. So you can kind of see the color patches where things are not as organized. And I come from English. I don't write in that subject area anymore, literary analysis, but that's how I worked when I did do that. Where the form isn't as prescribed as science writing, but you do have to create a clear structure of your own based on what you're writing about. So I'd say the key thing here with structure, and something that we don't think about, is the good use of repetition. So there's good repetition where we're always taught not to repeat ourselves for fear of being boring or just saying the same thing over and over and not extending our point. But that sometimes leads us to present our paper is quite disorganized for somebody new to it because they can't see the through line. So you kind of like a trail of breadcrumbs, like I'm going to use these terms, which you use in the introduction and the abstract. Keep using those terms, don't swap them out for something else. Or we'll talk today about the old new information pattern. So taking words or phrases from one sentence and chaining them by repeating them in the next sentence in order to create coherence and flow. Those things can help with the structure of the paper as well and how the reader understands that. So structure, audience. Like I said, you may have received a high mark on your paper. You might have won the poster presentation competition. Your professor may have encouraged you to seek publication, or you just want to throw your hat in the ring and you want to try. The issue that we tend to see again is reframing for a new audience. So you want to present yourself as trustworthy. So you want to make sure that you've attended to all of those ethical issues that I mentioned earlier, to citation, to show that you're trustworthy, particularly because you're somewhat new to a subject compared to what your professors might be. You also want to think about backing up your claims with logic, facts, evidence, all of the things that any discipline needs in order to demonstrate to an audience that they're being persuasive, in that the audience deserves and trusts receiving good evidence. And you also want to arouse interest. So you want to frame your topic in a way that helps the reader to understand, like, what's the point? So people outside the discipline, which may be even people, so you could be writing in, I don't know, you could be writing in English and you could be writing about Emily Dickinson, and somebody reading who's an expert in Chaucer really doesn't know a lot about that, even though they're in the same discipline. So really there are so many micro pockets of disciplines that, just think really broadly about who would need to know what as they're getting into the topic, and where they might get lost. So defining your terms early on would be helpful. So one thing you might do is ask reporters questions. So you read your draft, wherever you have a sentence, you might say, well, why? Or so what? And sometimes, not always, you can sort of push things a little bit further to explain more. You feel like you're maybe being obvious, but explaining more is always helpful, and any reader would appreciate that. So you might say in your paper, using such and such framework, I assessed a public health pamphlet on vaccines for readability and clarity. So what? Why would the reader care about that? It might seem self-evident, particularly during a pandemic, but really spelling out why you did it, what the significance of it, what the consequences of poor communication in public health communication is, what are the implications of your analysis. So it might seem obvious, but you do really have to obviously articulate the importance. Another example is showing how the research connects to a widespread concern and name that wider significance. So why would the reader care about that particular topic? So if I walked up to you on the street and said, oh, you know what, I noticed that I did a literature review, and apparently MCT oil really helps children with drug-resistant epilepsy. And most people would be like, okay, that's nice. So contextualizing it, it's not that they don't care about children with epilepsy, but they maybe need a little push to understand the larger topic around this. So saying, for example, in the beginning of your paper that epilepsy is very common in children, one of the most common neurologic conditions in children, but some children have drug-resistant epilepsy, and this is very devastating on their families and on the children. In fact, it can be deadly. But there's this amazing, if they're on a ketogenic diet, which some children move on to because it was created not for health and fitness people, but it was actually created in the 1930s for people with epilepsy. And it actually works in many cases, not all cases, drastically reducing carbohydrate and increasing fat. And the diet can actually slow down or eliminate seizures in some people. But the problem with children is that it's hard to get them to eat that much fat. And so MCT oil is flavorless. It can be supplemented to a lot of foods so that the children could get their fat macros. So explaining that is going to make the topic more interesting for your reader. So think about like the larger reason around it. If you're really struggling with this, there can be some pretty specific topics that you're like, I don't know why anybody outside my discipline would be interested in this. Ask your supervisor or professor that, like, what's the larger significance in your field? You're pretty new to the field, I'm assuming. And so you might not understand, well, I did this and it was fun and it was interesting. Why did I find it interesting? Disciplinary, in a disciplinary sense, might be different than why the public might think it, or why somebody in that field, like, where does it fit within the field? So that might have not been explained to you by your instructor, but you can ask them, like, why did we do this in a larger societal sense? Or what is the larger significance of that? And they're used to articulating that because they do that for when they look for funding. I've taken this from my colleague, Jill McMillan. Using a strong topic sentence is one way to give a frame of reference for the reader. So she has this in the green bubble on the right-hand side, on the bottom on the right-hand side. There's a pattern that you can use of introducing the topic, giving the research context, providing the temporal context or where it sits in time, and even a geographic context if that's relevant. So these are ways to give basic information that we might overlook, strangely. When we're really deep into a topic, we may forget, oh yeah, there's this bigger context around it that the reader doesn't know. Okay, so writing clearly and communicating clearly. I referenced already the old new information pattern. We'll talk about sentence variety and how that makes your writing less robotic and more clear. We'll talk about verbs and nouns and unclear pronouns, and we'll do something magical that I learned in my first year of university that had a tremendous effect on the quality of my writing, which the person who taught it to me called it the symptom check. And we'll work in some common phrases and transitions and some resources for finding how to use language to vary the type of language you're using, and common phrases that are used to do certain things, to demonstrate and to argue certain things in papers. This one I didn't learn until about 5 years ago. Even though I've been in writing studies for such a long time, I learned this from my colleague, Heather McWhinney. So the old new information pattern is a way to make connections between sentences and paragraphs, connections that may seem obvious to you but aren't crystal clear to others. It just is a nice way to help them follow along smoothly. So if you think about it like links in a chain, that might be helpful. So here's an example where it's not working. So this will happen in your first drafts quite often, and it's something to look at when you're revising to see if you can switch information around in sentences so that it's actually physically closer to where you mentioned it the last time. So here we have the new information at the beginning of the second sentence, which is garden lime or agricultural limestone. And then it moves on to talk about the pH of the soil, which was mentioned at the end of the first sentence. So you can see that they're not close together. So they're side by side in sentences, but the pH of the soil might be a better way to begin the second sentence in order to link it more clearly so that the reader, they have pH in their soil in their brain, and then that's continuing, and now you're moving to something else. Same with the third sentence, clay soil. Requires the addition of agricultural lime. So now agricultural lime is far away from where it was mentioned at the beginning of the second sentence. So here's maybe a revision that works a little bit better. So at the end of the first sentence, we have the word soil pH, and you can repeat that information at the beginning of the second sentence. Now, the way that we've typically been taught to write, we really have an instinct not to do this because we don't want to be repetitive. But I would encourage you to rethink that and think about how why we have that rule. And there are ways to repeat yourself where you're just saying the same thing over and over again. But in this sentence, you are adding a new point. So all you're doing with the repetition is connecting it to what you've just said so that the reader can follow along more easily. So you've just moved that word pH, soil pH, a little closer to the where you've mentioned it before. And then you introduce any new information, agricultural limestone in this case, at the end of the second sentence, and repeat it now. Now it's old information at the beginning of the next sentence. And then you're going to talk about clay soil at the end of the third sentence, and you can guess what happens next if you continue to talk about clay soil. So you can get a little bit too, this is something you're not going to do necessarily with every single sentence in your paper, but it's something that can, even if you sprinkle a few of these old new information patterns throughout your paragraphs, it's going to make a big difference in the flow and the clarity of your writing. And it's one of those concepts that has improved my writing. You can coast for a long time writing at a certain level and thinking that, okay, this is all right. And then you can find this one tip that really goes, oh, that really made a big difference in the clarity, my writing clarity. So I really like that one. Here's an example from history. So from L.C. Leddy, 2017, in the Canadian Historical Review. And this is done maybe in a less obvious way. But so in the first sentence, we have the words shed a famous tear. And then the author repeats that at the beginning of the next sentence, this image. So sometimes we're told don't start a sentence with this unless we say what it is. And that's what they're doing here. This what? This image of a crying Indian in quotation marks is mentioned at the beginning of the sentence to link it to the previous sentence. So you can kind of rephrase what, you don't have to use the exact words, you can rephrase it a little bit if you don't want to be so repetitive. And then at the end of the next sentence, we have Shepherd Crutch the Third's, it's a great name, 1999 monograph is the new information, and it now becomes old information in the next sentence, which is two little words, his work. And then at the end of the next sentence, we have Berkhofer and his study mentioned. And then at the beginning of the next sentence, we have it as old information in it, the study, and then Berkhofer's name repeated. So this is the way it might look in another paper. Here's one more example. Biofortification is mentioned at the beginning of the first sentence, and it's mentioned again at the beginning of the next sentence. It's fine. You can make it a little bit stronger. Wait a second. Oh no, the first one is better. Yeah, so you have the old information at the beginning of the second sentence. And then in the second example, you have them quite distant. So the effect, if we had time, I'd read these out loud, and you can see that the effect is once the reader starts reading the second sentence in the second example, they're kind of like, where am I now? Wait, where am I? And then the information doesn't come till the end of the sentence. It can kind of cause people to have to read a sentence over again to reestablish context. One tip for creating old new information pattern is using this or these plus the noun or what it is you just talked about in the previous sentence. Sentence variety. I'm not going to do a full grammar lesson in terms of the three grammatical types of sentence in English. English has three types of sentence. One is just simple, so subject, verb, object. One is compound, subject, verb, or subject, verb, object, and a coordinating conjunction like but or and. There are a number of them. And then another subject, verb, object. The verbs I've shown in orange here. And then we have the compound complex, or complex. I wrote that incorrectly, where we have a subordinating conjunction like although or if or because before the subject, verb, object. One of the subject verb objects in a sentence with two parts to it or two subject verb objects. So that's a whole other workshop if you're interested in learning more about that. But what happens here is that you can see with the second and the third sentence, you're showing connections between things. So in with the word but or and, you're showing, like with and, for example, you're showing addition. So you're adding two things together. So it's quite simple. But then you can show even more complexity of relationship when you use a subordinating conjunction such as although or if or when. So you can show cause and effect, for example. So your writing becomes more clear. So sentence variety grammatically is important to clarity and to rhythm. So when something flows and it's really natural, that's a technical thing that's happening. It's not, inspiration or anything artistic happening. It's technical. Not that art can't be technical. So looking back, and a lot of good writers don't even know they're doing this, but there's a variety of different types of sentence grammatically, but there's also, like, if you were to get a ruler, you can measure short, medium, and long sentences roughly that create a rhythm. So you don't have that staccato effect. If you think about music, just stop, start, stop, start, stop, start, you have more flow because you have that rhythm of short, medium, long. Makes it easier for your reader. Here are the three grammatical structures at work in a paper that was published last year in Nature. So the first sentence is a complex sentence starting with a subordinating conjunction. The next two are simple sentences. They're just subject, verb, object. And the final sentence is a uses the coordinating conjunction in two simple sentences. It's a compound sentence, so three types of sentence. And here are just short, medium, long. The beginning sentence, and you often see this actually in writing, is the first sentence will be quite punchy, very short sentence. And then some longer sentences and shorter sentences are interspersed throughout. So that's something to think about in your writing. And so by short, in academic writing, short can be a little longer than what we would write normally, say in an email. The third thing to look for are what are called nominalizations. Helen Sword has a great book called The Writer's Diet. It's, strangely enough, it is, here it is, a skinny little book, The Writer's Diet, and it's $20 for such a tiny little book, but the library has copies of that, and so does the Writing Centre. So she's got great writing tips. One of her topics is the zombie noun phenomenon, and there's a great animated video from TED that explains this better than I would, I think. Things to look for: words that have these word endings. So once you find them, what do you do? So things like explanation, contribution, you might find those just with the TION ending. So not all of them will have those endings. So maybe just look for nouns, which are people, places, or things. I would say when we're talking about zombie nouns, it's things. So instead of saying this has an effect on this, which is something we read all the time in academic writing, it can be tightened a little bit. Oh, thanks for posting the link, Merle. It can be tightened a little bit by turning it into a verb or into an action. So when you see the noun, think, can I turn this into an action word instead? So instead of the performance of the medication, you could say the medication's performance. Instead of makes a contribution to this topic, you could say it contributes to this topic. It really energizes your writing and gives it more clarity, and it cuts out a lot of wordiness as well. So I really like that tip. We did talk about using this and these at the beginning of sentences. So here's just another example of making sure that the pronouns at the beginning of your sentences are not unclear in what they refer back to. So it's pronoun antecedent if you've taken grammar, but all you need to know, you don't need to know that terminology, is whenever you use a pronoun like I, you, he, she, it, we, you, they, this, that, those types of pronouns replace nouns. So instead of saying Joe, 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 I'll say he or his instead of Joe, just as a shorthand of referring back. But sometimes that pronoun reference can become unclear. So make sure that when you're looking for your pronouns in your paper, that what it refers back to is clear. Here's the symptom check thing that I was taught in first year. So the first English essay I wrote, wanted some feedback. And so I showed it to the professor, and they read it and they said, come back to me. Here is once you've gone through your paper looking for these words, try to revise the sentences that have these words to get rid of them. And so they wrote them down on a Post-it note, and I thought, well, they're fine words. Why would I care about that? So if you go through your writing, you can I was at that generation where we're still using typewriters. We were straddling between typewriters and word processors. Thankfully, I had a word processor. So you can do Control F or Command F on your keyboard and look for those words one at a time. And although it's tedious, it's a great exercise because you can see which ones you're using more than others. So I had an editing project. I edited somebody's dissertation when I was a student. It was my uncle's actually. And so I said to him, I can save you a lot of money if you just do a little work first and go through your writing. And every time you use the word that, try to revise the sentence to get rid of it. And so he came back with, 20 pages fewer than when he gave it to me to begin with. And the writing was a lot tighter. So some of them we use, as individuals, we use them habitually. So this little Post-it note really helped me. I had it taped to my desktop, my computer screen for a long time. So why would you look for these words? These words aren't the disease, they're symptoms of the disease. So these, again, are perfectly good words. We need these words. We use them all the time. We don't always want to get rid of them, but they can be symptoms, kind of like a fever is a symptom of an illness, of the illness of wordiness. So when we rearrange a sentence to get rid of them, we can write more concisely. We can really tighten up our writing, which helps our reader. So here's an example. So if you were to look at this, we have is, who, was, to be, and by from that original list. So those would have, this one would have really lit up when we search for particular words. One way to, normally I'd have you do this as an activity. I am, I think, starting to go over time though. So a way to revise it, one way to think about it is not just going through and trying to, but rearranging the sentence. This activity often requires moving the pieces of the sentence around and thinking about approaching it, entering it in a different way. So if we start this sentence with the group instead of this, we can tighten it up quite a bit. And that's changing it, just as a side point, changing it to active voice from passive voice, where the doer of the action is emphasized or put first. So you can see that we could reduce it in a couple of different ways. We don't always have to get rid of every one of those words, but it really tightens it up. All right. Another one, there are, who, have, it is, who, by. These two sentences, in the interest of time, I'll just show you. You can usually take out, there are, you can usually take out who, have. It is, starting sentences like that, just as you starting it with there are, think about just getting rid of it and starting right away with the doers of the action. Finally, there are some common phrases in transitions that we're not really taught overtly or intentionally. We just pick them up, we absorb them as we're reading, and we repeat them and use them as common phrases that we use in academic writing. There's a great website, if you just Google the Manchester Academic Phrase Bank, it shows you some ways of doing this, and I have a screenshot on the next slide. And there's also just classic transitional expressions like to signal transition. So if you're always using the word however, maybe there's other ways to communicate that to vary it a little bit. I would say more useful though is the Manchester Academic Phrase Bank. So if you are explaining cause and effect in your paper, as you can see on the left of the screen where the little arrow is pointing, you just click on that, and if you scroll down, it will give you a whole bunch of examples of language that is used to show cause and effect so that you can vary your writing a little bit. So you can see that there are ones for being cautious, critical, classifying and listing, defining terms. This is a really wonderful resource. We tend to really show it to grad students a lot, but we should be showing it to undergrads more. So here's some transition use that is used to describe a process in a method section. So just little things like then, followed by, afterwards, after. You can see that they've also renamed what they were talking about, the reaction, they've used repetition to reinforce that, those transitions as well. So the old new information pattern can also reinforce those transitions along with words like afterwards or however, or furthermore. Finally, just a couple of bonus writing tips. Take breaks as you revise. I think it's really something that we forget quite often is that in order to achieve distance, we need to take breaks. So do a page at a time, do a section at a time. Spend 20 minutes, don't think about it at all, come back to it. So the word revise means to see again. So it's like seeing with fresh eyes. And we can't really do that if we, sit down for 3 or 4 hours and really get in there. It's hard to see things jump out at you with fresh eyes. If that doesn't help, you can have somebody else read it and provide feedback, such as a writing center tutor or a friend, but spread the work of revision out over time. And the second one is look at other journal articles, and the ones that you like, the ones that you found clear and easy to read. Nature has really good writing and good editors, so I like going to Nature magazine for examples. But you just ask the question, instead of thinking about the topic that they're writing about, think about how the paper is constructed. Why is it good? What moves do they make in their writing to make it good? Where are they using repetition? How do they transition between paragraphs? If you found words that you thought were neat and you want to try, put them down in a little notebook. I'm going to try using that word sometime. So think about writing. English majors are great at this. I'll put in a plug for English majors of thinking about a piece of writing as a piece of writing, not just about what it's about. So that would be my final bonus writing tip. And some resources for help so that you know you're not alone. Using liaison librarians and specialist librarians for assistance in finding journals and in evaluating the quality of a journal. The Writing Center can help you as well. We have about 30 tutors from a number of disciplines, so we can match you with somebody who is in your particular area that you're writing in. Looking at existing literature, as I mentioned on the last slide. Conferences and poster presentations are a great way to test your work with an audience and to understand where the holes are in your explanations. Talk to your professor, don't be shy about that. Supervisor research coaches, and get used to using a citation manager as well. That's just another little tip, like Zotero or Mendeley. Learn how to use a citation manager. It'll really help your research go more smoothly and help you to cite more accurately. So that's what I have for today. Sorry for, I think I went over time a little bit, but
No, I think you're still good. My
great.
clock says 11:58, 11:54. You're great.
Okay.
If anyone has any questions, now is the time, and please feel free to put them in the chat or to unmute yourself and just ask. Leave. I always learn something. It's funny. You'd think after, publishing books and articles and blog posts and journalism pieces and everything else that I wouldn't learn something new, but I do. I learn something new every time. And what I learned today was your last point about remembering that each piece you write is its own piece of writing, and that it has its own purpose. It has its own life and energy sort of built right into the piece. And I think that that's a really, really important thing to
Yeah.
remember. And I really liked that. Thank you.
Yeah. Moving away from that idea of correctness or the way it's done and thinking more about why it's done this way and who's my audience in this particular case. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. I think that that's great. I'm going to stop the recording, but please send your questions in on the chat, and then we will also give our thanks to Liv for being with us today. Thank you for being
Thanks
with
for
us
having
today.
me. Mhm.